Okay, so swatching and gauge figuring outing episode 3. So now we're going to use the information that we had in the last video. So if you recall, when we counted our gauge on our swatch that we had, we ended up with 16 stitches equals 4 inches. I divided the number of stitches by the number of inches to find out how many stitches I have in 1 inch of my knitting. And so 4 divided into 16 gives me 4 stitches per 1 inch of fabric that I was knitting. The row gauge on that swatch that I showed in the last episode was 28 rows equals 4 inches. When I divide 28 by 4, you get 7 rows equals 1 inch. So now the next big step, and you'll see that I have a calculator here. That's just a prop because I just don't want anybody to be scared, because now we're going to do some math, easy math, but I'm going to show you exactly how you do it. So my pattern that I have, I'm just going to move this up. I had to write this out because I can't write upside down for you to be able to see. So the pattern that I'm using has a pattern gauge of 20 stitches for 4 inches and 35 rows for 4 inches. So you can see that I like the fabric that I made in my gauge swatch. I like the yarn that I'm using, but my row gauge and stitch gauge doesn't match what the pattern calls for. But I want to knit with what I had chosen instead. So it's very easy to do the calculation so that you can knit with the fabric that you want, or knit the fabric that you want and fit it into the pattern. So if I do the same math on the pattern gauge as that I did for our swatch gauge, then I have 20 stitches divided by 4 inches, and that actually gives me 5 stitches equals 1 inch. And I have 35 rows equals 4 inches, called 4 in the pattern. And if I do that, it doesn't come out to be a nice even number, but it's 8.75 rows equals 1 inch. In this case, this is a pattern for a sweater, so I'm not too worried about that, because most patterns, like I said, will give you more of a length knit until you reach a certain number of inches, but at least I have the information so I can use it if I want. So now I have to see what the pattern says, and I look at the schematic and I look at the measurements of the pattern, and then I see how many, what the first part of the pattern is, the cast on. So this is not a real pattern, by the way. It's all just kind of fictitious, just so you get the idea of what you have to do. So because it's always done the same way. So I'm just going to move this up. So my fake pattern tells me to cast on 200 stitches for the circumference, and my schematic tells me that let's say it's your chest measurement or some measurement on the pattern, equals 40 inches. So I know that according to this pattern, 200 stitches is going to give me 40 inches of fabric. So and that makes sense, because my gauge was 20 stitches. So 5 stitches per 1 inch, 20 stitches per 4 inch. And if I divide 200 stitches by 5 stitches for each inch of fabric, I get 40. So all of that makes sense. So that's fine for the pattern, but what about my own gauge that I wanted to use, which is different? So my pattern tells me to cast on 200 stitches, and the circumference of the project that I'm doing will be 40 inches. My project, the yarn that I want to use with my needle size that gives me the fabric that I want, is 4 stitches per 1 inch. So the calculation is fairly straightforward. I have 4 stitches per 1 inch, and I need to get 40 inches to get the circumference of the project that I'm doing. So 40 inches times 4 stitches equals 160 stitches. So because my gauge for my fabric is bigger than the gauge that the pattern was written for, I actually need less stitches to give me the width of the fabric that I need. So what I do is, I've got a couple choices. I can look at the pattern and see if the next size down happens to use 160 stitches for the pattern. If that's the case, I just knit the next size down. And that seems scary, but if you've done a good job on your blocking and your washing and your measuring, it has to work. It's just math, so it has to work. Likewise, if my gauge was the other way around and a lot tighter than the gauge that was called on the pattern, then I would do just do the same kind of math, and I might have to go up a size on the pattern size. So it just depends on the difference. So this is very simplistic and kind of not a real pattern. As I said, I just kind of made it so that the math would work. But if you understand how this is done, then you should be able to convert this simple type of calculation, which is the most common probably. You should be able to do that, convert your patterns that way. So that's as much as I'm going to talk about that. We can talk about row gauge in some other episodes and gets more complicated. But for now, this will get you solve most of the problems that you may have if your fabric is a little bit different.